there, and welcome to my Fashion Stories Box podcast, a podcast about stories in fashion history. I am Catherine, your host, and I'm glad to see you here. Today, we are diving into a topic that has shaped societies and culture throughout history: origins of gender identification through clothes. From ancient civilizations to modern day fashion trends, clothing has always played a crucial role in expressing gender identity. But how did these associations begin, and how have they evolved over time? In this episode, we'll journey through different eras, examining how clothing has been used to define and distinguish gender roles. We'll also look at how gender definition and perception shaped dressing habits. And finally, we'll see how contemporary movements are changing and redefining gender identification norms today. So, whether you're an history nerd, a fashion enthusiast, or just curious about the cultural significance of clothing, this episode is for you. Let's get started on our exploration of gender and fashion through the ages. Before exploring what were the clothing habits to translate the gender of the wearer, let's define some keywords here: the gender and sex. This might prove useful for the continuity of this topic. The World Health Organization defines sex as the different biological and physiological characteristics of males and females, such as reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormones, and so on, while gender is defined as the socially constructed characteristics of men and women, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between groups of women and men. It varies from society to society and can be changed. The concept of gender includes five main elements: relational, hierarchical, historical, contextual, and institutional. In other words, the sex is objective, defined by nature, while the gender is subjective and set by the society. With that in mind, let's start our journey in the ancient world with civilizations like Egypt, Greece, and Rome to understand their definition and perception of this notion of gender and how it's been translated through clothing. Even though the ancient Egyptian society was constructed as a patriarchal one, men and women were considered as equal, and women could benefit from the same opportunities, access the same type of education and occupation than men. This has to be linked with the vision ancient Egyptians had about the natural order, which was a question of maintaining a balance, an equilibrium between the different forces. A loss of equilibrium would lead to disorder and chaos. You even have a sort of androgenicity in the representation of men and women. And this social organization and the relatively small differences between both genders' roles is translated in their dress style. Men typically wore kilt-like garments called chandits, whose materials, fabrics, embellishments, and lengths depended on their social status and role in the hierarchy of the society. Generally, women wore dresses called calasiris, reaching usually the ankles. However, they could also wear the chandits as for men, or even being naked, as nudity wasn't considered as a social taboo. Jewelry, footwear, headpieces as wigs and crowns, makeup, and other accessories weren't linked with the gender of the wearer. They would be worn indifferently by both men and women. They were here just to reflect societal roles and hierarchy. Moving to ancient Greece, we see a certain change in the perception of genders. The society is still a patriarchal one, but equality between men and women is not part of the social order. On the contrary, the vision of the natural order of things is more a dichotomian one: the strongs and the weaks, the rulers and the ruled, the rulers being the men and the ruled being women mostly. And for that, we need to thank one particular person, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and its perception of genders based on their biological and intellectual features. Aristotle believed women were deformed males and imperfect versions of the male sex. He thought women's bodies were too cold to produce the vital heat required to fully form a fetus into male. This made them inherently defective. Women were seen as passive and lacking the ability to provide forms or soul to matter, unlike the active male principle. From the intellectual perspective, Aristotle viewed women as unable to control themselves through reason like men could. He considered women's souls and capacity for rational thought to be inferior to men's, while acknowledging some intellectual strengths in women like prudence, memory, and so on. He still saw them as less suited for abstract reasoning than men. Based on his beliefs about female biological and mental deficiencies, Aristotle argued women were suited only for domestic roles, not politics or public life. He justified male domination and women's subordinate status as unnatural and fitting their perceived inherent natures. So, in a sense, Aristotle pronounced a hierarchical view of gender rooted in biological determinism, using it to justify restricting women to the private domestic sphere while reserving public affairs for men as the so called superior sex. His ideas, as you might have already understood, profoundly shaped later Western attitudes towards gender for centuries. Add to that the general modesty principle which ruled the lifestyle of ancient Greeks, and you have the full picture of this society. In terms of dress, how was this difference of gender perception reflected? Well, in fact, men and women would wear the same basic type of garment, a tunic, called a chiton for men and a peplos for women, fastened at the waist with a belt. As outerwear, a shawl-like garment was worn called immersion. The difference between men and women would lie in the fact that women's clothes would be generally more restrictive, understand, longer, and more covering than the ones worn by men. And if you look at the hairstyle, men would keep their hair longer and natural and wear the beard, while women would style their hair with braids and buns and crowns and cover the head. In Rome, the gender perception was very similar to the ancient Greek one, inherited from Aristotle. Men were the rulers and women the ruled. Men had an active part in the social life, while women a passive one, their position being defined in relation to their fathers and husbands. Women were considered having poor judgment capacities and primitive sex drive, making them irrational. The ideal Roman woman was a matron, spun her own cloth, oversaw a family's affairs, provided her husband with children, food, and a well run household, at the same time displaying suitable modesty. How was it translated in terms of clothes? Roman men and women would be dressed in very similar ways as ancient Greek men and women. The only difference being for men who, alongside with the territorial expansion of the Roman Empire, would incorporate dress habits from conquered tribes. Women would still wear the palla and the stola, the tunic and the shawl, as their main garments. And in terms of hairstyles, Roman men tended to have their hair cut short and shave their face, while women would style their hair in sophisticated buns with braids and curls. Throughout the majority of the European Middle Ages, men and women clothing would stay relatively similar in style, differing mainly in length and coverage, longer and more covering for women, thus following the general principle of gender identification inherited from the Roman period. Men wore tunics and hoses, while women attire consisted of long gowns and kirtles. Genders were underlined more by accessories, particularly headwear and hairstyle, which were generally more sophisticated for women, while underlining their roles and stage of life. We need to wait for the last centuries of the Middle Ages to notice more gender specific garments. A major shift occurred during the 14th and 15th centuries, which are considered as the early time of the Renaissance period. Not only this period saw the apparition of the modern concept of fashion, a faster change in silhouettes, and the advent of more elaborate clothing styles, but clothes started to be used to emphasize body parts, accentuating and exaggerating male and female attributes through forms and tailoring. Gender roles started to slowly shift, with women gaining, all proportion kept, a bit more power. Just think of women as Queen Elizabeth I of England or Catherine de' Medici in France, who ruled directly or as regent their respective countries and contributed to their cultural influence. However, these women were more the exception than the rule. The ideal Renaissance woman had to be silent, discreet, and modest. They acted as the visual testimony of their family's wealth, but their main role was to get married and have children. If the Renaissance sees a cult of the appearance developing, dress was here to underline the wealth and the body parts of each gender considered as attractive. Dresses for men became shorter, displaying the legs, which had to be long and muscular, and were considered as what I call the new sexy. Their bottom garments, the breeches, would reach the knees or even mean tights, being more or less voluminous and looking like skirts. The crotch part was revealed, even emphasized, with a so called modest accessory, the codpiece, which was here mostly to reinforce the virility of men, while the doublets, a jacket like garment, were padded to make the torso and shoulders look powerful. All of these garments were used to physically impose the wearer in the society and make sure people understood how powerful and desirable he was. For women, modesty in dress was key. Their garments were here to cover as much as possible, but they also served as a metaphor for their position and expected social role. The corset appeared to make the bodies fitter and fitter and the waist slimmer and slimmer. The farthingale appeared, a hoop understructure worn under the skirts to create more volume. These two new garments made breathing and moving more complicated, forcing women to stay in the same place, to be dependent from men, to put them in a physical and psychological prison. The 17th century didn't see much change when it comes to gender perceptions in the European societies. Men were still in charge, and women were required to display modesty, courtesy, gentleness, affability, and good government, to obey the commandments of the apostles, according to whom women needed to be silent and learn of their husbands at home. Gervase Markham, an English poet and writer who was born around 1568 and who died in 1637, published in 1615 a book entitled The English Housewife, containing the inward and outward virtues which ought to be in a complete woman, and listed the following qualities expected from the perfect woman: of chaste thought, stout courage, patient, untired, watchful, diligent, witty, pleasant, constant in friendship, full of good neighborhood, wise in discourse, but not frequent therein, sharp and quick of speech, but no bitter or talkative, secret in her affairs, comfortable in her counsels, and generally skilful in the worthy knowledges which to belong to her vocation. Try to put that on your Tinder bio. And what about fashion? To reaffirm their power, men started to wear heels, a trend launched by the French king Louis XIV, another way to physically impose oneself, while the silhouette for women started to soften. The corset was still here, but the bottom understructure disappeared. The breasts and forearms were more displayed with open necklines showing the shoulders and sleeve reaching the elbows. The female body starts to be sexualized while the male body is all about assessing power, grandeur, and authority. The 18th century is the century of cultural and political revolutions. Past thoughts and philosophies are re-questioned. The established social order is re-questioned. The monarchies and aristocracy are challenged with the rise of the middle class and the beginning of the industrialization. One particular event will redistribute the cards in the fashion game, but not only the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, the gender signage through clothing remained more or less the same. Men wore breeches reaching the knees, shoes with heels, wigs and makeup. Women also wore extravagant wigs, makeup, shoes with heels, and a variety of dresses, including the famous robe à la française, with its panier exaggerated the width of the hips and emphasizing the waist, and of course, our corset. The Rococo style was all about pastel colors, floral prints, an exuberance of lace and other embellishments worn both by men and women. In other words, a gender-fluid trend. This symbolical moment of the French Revolution is important to notice. Before, it is less a question of masculine or feminine fashion and more about social classes, the elite and the rest of the society. As we could see, there was a certain fluidity between what men and men could wear, particularly in terms of colors, prints, embellishments, accessories, jewelry, shoes. After the revolution and the abolition of class privileges, this would change. Colors, prints, embellishments, and so on will be associated with the nobility and its excesses, and men will decide to give up on it. This is what we call the Great Masculine Renunciation. This term has been coined in 1930 by the Anglo-German psychologist John Flugel. Influenced by the Enlightenment philosophy of the 18th century, men abandoned their claim to adornment and beauty, focusing only on usefulness, leading to the adoption of neutral colors, mostly dark ones, and the suits during the 19th century. Starting from that moment, fashion had just one gender. It was feminine. Fashion started to be considered as futile and unnecessary, the same way women were considered throughout the 19th century. Beautiful and fragile beings prone to hysteria, thus needing to be controlled by men. The ideal woman was a wife and mother whose main role was to raise children and act as the window display of her husband or father's wealth. Nothing really changed since the Romans. While the silhouette for men didn't change much starting from the middle of the 19th century until the Second World War, the silhouette for women underwent radical changes from the hourglass silhouette with the crinoline, the S-band silhouette with the bustles, the corset shaping the breasts and the waist, the changes in hemline lengths, and so on. All this made to reinforce gender identification and role perception in the society. By the end of the 19th century, in European societies, it was acted that men would wear pants, suits, have their hair short, few accessories, neutral colors, no embellishments. Failing to do so, men would be considered effeminate, that is to say, displaying attributes associated with women as frivolity and irrationality. This was what happened to the 19th century dandies and their gender transgressions by adopting feminine codes as corsets, makeup, and a general attention to their appearance. On their side, women had to wear long and complicated garments full of embellishments and skirts. And those willing to change this gender conception through clothes by notably wearing pants, the supreme male and power status symbol, would be prosecuted. The 20th century saw dramatic shifts in gender roles, especially during and after the World Wars. While men were requested to fight on the war fronts, women had to take over their roles and enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They weren't limited to their traditional role of mothers and wives anymore, and they started to play an active economic and political role. This shift leads to practical changes in their clothing. Trousers, previously reserved for men, became acceptable for women during the war years due to their practicality. The 60s and particularly the 70s brought the emergence of unisex fashion. Designers like Yves Saint Laurent introduced clothing that blurred traditional gender lines, such as the iconic Le Smoking Tuxedo suit for women. This era marked the beginning of a slow but steady shift towards more fluid interpretations of gender in fashion. And not to forget Jean-Paul Gaultier in the 80s, who was trying to make men wearing skirts and corsets, moving towards a more gender-fluid silhouette. Today, we see a growing acceptance and celebration of gender-neutral and non-binary fashion. Brands like Off-White and its For All collection in 2018, Gucci and its MX project in 2020, Prada and their Fluid Form collections, or even Louis Vuitton and their Spring-Summer 2021 collection, to add on them designers like Harris Reeds and Telfar Clements, are challenging traditional gender norms by creating clothing that anyone can wear regardless of gender. Social movements advocating for LGBTQA+ rights and gender equality have significantly influenced fashion. The visibility of non-binary and genderqueer individuals in media and fashion has pushed the industry towards more inclusive designs. The role of media and celebrities cannot be overstated in that matter. Personalities as Jaden Smith, Billy Porter, Elliot Page, Demi Lovato, and Harry Styles have made headlines by wearing clothing that defies traditional gender norms, influencing public perceptions and encouraging a more inclusive view on fashion. I would like to conclude this episode on one interesting fact. You may have noticed that on paintings from past centuries, until a certain age, young boys and young girls would be dressed exactly the same, following a silhouette we would associate with our modern eyes with girls. This custom dates back to at least the 16th century, when it was common for all young children in Europe to be dressed in gowns or dresses until around the age of 6 or 7 years. In the 16th to the 19th century period, boys of all classes wore dresses as young children, from aristocrats to commoners. This practice has been dictated by three main reasons: practical, social, and cultural reasons. The practical reasons are that dresses were easier for changing diapers and underwear during potty training years. They allowed more room for growth compared to trousers, reducing costs as children grew quickly, and they were simpler to make and hand down as hand-me-downs between siblings of different genders. As for the social reasons, I found out that this practice reflected the Aristotelian view in medieval Europe that gender differences were by degree rather than kind. Dresses were simply considered practical unisex children's clothing, not symbolic of gender. The so-called breeching ceremony, taking place around the age between 6 and 8 years old, marked a symbolic transition to masculinity when boys began wearing trousers. And when it comes to the cultural reasons, I found out that in some regions like Ireland, dresses were believed to protect boys from fairy abductions, and upper-class families dressed boys and as girls to protect them from being kidnapped. So, while rooted in pragmatism initially, the tradition perpetuated due to social norms and beliefs about childhood innocence before gender roles were strictly enforced through clothing. This practice declined in the early 20th century as gender binary concepts solidified. And when it comes to pink is for girls and blue is for boys, this gender association of colors is a relatively modern phenomenon appearing mid-20th century and spreading particularly after the Second World War. Indeed, after the Second World War, mass marketing and consumer culture capitalized on emphasizing gender distinctions to sell products like clothing, toys, and accessories color-coded for boys and girls. Influential figures like Mamie Eisenhower, Marilyn Monroe, and Brigitte Bardot helped popularize pink as a feminine color in the 50s and 60s through their visibility and fashion choices. When it comes to gender identification through clothing, it seems that everything is just a question of marketing and generation of profits. As we've explored, the history of gender identification through clothing is rich and complex. From ancient civilizations to modern-day trends, clothing has been a powerful tool for expressing and enforcing gender roles. Two periods are particularly interesting to analyze to understand how modern gender perception through fashion. The 19th century, with its industrial revolution and the genderification of society, and the post-Second World War period with the rise of marketing efforts to encourage mass consumption. Today, we stand at a crossroads where traditional gender norms are being challenged and fashion is becoming a more inclusive space for all gender identities. However, let's not forget that gender identification and perception is a moving social norm influenced by political positions, making its fashion translation highly political too. Thank you for joining me on this journey through fashion history. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and check out more episodes of my Fashion Stories Box podcast. If you are inspired to start your own podcast, contact me. I can help you for that. And if you have any questions about today's topic, feel free to reach out. You can find more information and resources on my website, accessible in the description of this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen your podcast. Connect with me on Instagram and Facebook to carry on the discussion. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review. I am Catherine, and this is my Fashion Stories Box podcast, a podcast about stories in fashion history. See you next time for a new Fashion Story Box.